The light in the Oval Office was always different in the late afternoon. A thick, honey-colored glow that caught the dust motes dancing between the heavy velvet curtains and the clutter of ship models on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's desk. General George Catlett Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, sat rigidly in the leather chair, his spine a straight line of Virginian steel that refused to yield to the fatigue of 3 years of global incineration. He looked at the map spread before them, a map of the French coastline, the jagged teeth of the Cotentin Peninsula, and the beaches that would soon be known by names like Omaha and Utah. For Marshall, this map was not just a strategic document. It was the culmination of his entire existence. Every decision he had made since 1939, every political skirmish he had fought with Congress to expand the draft, every grueling hour spent selecting the bright young men like Eisenhower and Bradley had been a prelude to this moment. He could smell the faint scent of the president's Camel cigarettes and the medicinal tang that always seemed to cling to the air around Roosevelt these days, a reminder of the physical toll the war was taking on the man in the chair. But Marshall's mind was across the Atlantic, imagining the freezing spray of the English Channel and the weight of the responsibility that came with commanding the greatest invasion in human history. He had spent his life preparing for the field, for the smell of cordite and the visceral reality of command. Yet he had spent this war in a limestone building in Virginia, moving divisions like chess pieces on a board. Now, with Operation Overlord looming, the prize was within reach. It was an unspoken understanding throughout Washington and London that Marshall was the only choice to lead the Allied Expeditionary Force. He wanted it with a hunger that he kept buried under layers of professional decorum, a hunger that gnawed at him during the sleepless nights in his quarters at Fort Myer. He thought of his wife, Catherine, and the way she looked at him when he returned home late, her eyes reflecting the quiet knowledge that her husband was carrying the weight of millions of lives. He thought of the young men whose names he had signed onto mobilization orders, and the deep, silent need to be there with them, to share the mud and the danger, rather than directing it from a distance. The president was speaking, his voice a melodic rasp, talking about the upcoming Cairo and Tehran conferences, about Stalin's demands and Churchill's stubbornness. But Marshall was focused on the silence between the words. He felt the vibration of the world outside the window, the sirens of the capital, the frantic energy of a nation at war. But in this room, the air was heavy with a decision that had not yet been voiced. He adjusted his spectacles, his fingers brushing the cool metal, and waited. He knew the president was weighing him against the geography of the war. Roosevelt needed him in Washington. He was the organizer of victory, the one man who could handle the fractious Joint Chiefs and the mercurial Prime Minister. But Marshall was a soldier, and a soldier's soul belongs to the front. The tension in the room was a physical pressure, a tightening in Marshall's chest that he refused to acknowledge. He watched Roosevelt's hands, those powerful, restless hands, as they toyed with a silver letter opener. The president looked tired, his face lined with the shadows of 1,000 crises, yet his eyes remained sharp, searching Marshall's face for something, perhaps a sign of weakness, or perhaps a sign of the very strength that would make him too valuable to lose. Marshall remained a mask of professional composure, though inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was 58 years old, and he knew that if he did not take this command, he would never lead men in battle again. This was the peak of the mountain. He remembered the mud of France in 1917, the lessons learned under Pershing, and the long, lean years of the interwar period when the army was a skeleton and he was a dreamer building a force from nothing. He had built the sword. Now he felt he had the right to wield it. The clock on the mantel ticked with agonizing precision, marking the seconds of a world in suspense. Roosevelt leaned forward, the light catching the sweat on his forehead, and the air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving Marshall in a vacuum of anticipation. The president began to speak of the Supreme Command, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur, and Marshall felt the world narrow down to the space between them, a bridge of history about to be crossed or burned. The silence that followed Roosevelt's initial preamble was not empty. It was a pressurized chamber, thick with the unsaid. The president leaned back, his wheelchair creaking, a sound that always seemed amplified in the quiet moments of the Oval Office. He didn't look at Marshall. Instead, he looked at a small model of a destroyer on his desk, his fingers tracing the tiny guns. "George," the president said, and the use of his first name was a rare departure from the formal general that usually defined their relationship. "I've been thinking about the command of Overlord. I've been thinking about it every night." Marshall felt a coldness settle in his stomach, a premonition that chilled the heat of his ambition. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He waited for the blow. Roosevelt sighed, a long, rattling sound that seemed to come from his very bones. "If you go to Europe, George, who would be my chief of staff? Who would handle the Admiral Kings and the Douglas MacArthurs? Who would talk to the Congress when they want to cut the throat of the war effort?" Marshall's mind raced through the names. Eisenhower, Bradley, Somerville. But he knew what the president was doing. He was building a cage of necessity. "I feel," Roosevelt continued, finally turning those piercing blue eyes toward Marshall, "that I couldn't sleep at night with you out of the country." The words were a compliment of the highest order, a testament to Marshall's indispensability, but to the general they sounded like a death knell for his greatest ambition. He felt a sudden sharp pang of loss, as if a limb had been severed. The image of the French beaches, the roar of the landing craft, the historic weight of the Great Crusade, it all began to recede into a distance he could never bridge. He thought of Eisenhower, the man he had plucked from obscurity and mentored, the man who would likely take the prize instead. He felt no bitterness toward Ike, but he felt a profound aching hollow where his own future had been. He could feel the pulse in his temple, a steady, rhythmic throb that matched the ticking clock. He realized that this was the ultimate test of his character, the moment where the martial system of selfless service was no longer a philosophy for his subordinates, but a demand upon his own soul. He thought of the thousands of letters he had written to mothers whose sons would not be coming home. He thought of the enormous, crushing responsibility of the office he currently held. If he asked for the command, Roosevelt would give it to him. The president had made that clear in earlier discussions. He wanted Marshall to have what he wanted, but he was asking Marshall to choose the welfare of the nation over the glory of the soldier, the technical reality of the war, the logistical nightmare of the Pacific, the fragile alliance with the British, the upcoming demands of the post-war world, all demanded Marshall's presence in the Pentagon. He saw the maps in his mind, not of beaches, but of supply lines stretching across the globe, of political minefields in the Senate, of the delicate ego of Winston Churchill. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. He looked at Roosevelt, and for a moment the two men were just two aging humans caught in the gears of a global catastrophe. The president was waiting for him to speak, to claim the prize, or to offer the sacrifice. Marshall's throat felt dry, the air tasting of old paper and tobacco. He thought of his own legacy, of how history would record this moment. Would he be the man who led the invasion, or the man who stayed behind to ensure its success? The internal struggle was violent, but silent. He felt the sweat slicking his palms. He knew that whatever he said next would define the rest of his life, and perhaps the outcome of the war. He took a slow, deep breath, centering himself, pulling the mantle of the general back over the raw nerves of the man. He would not beg. He would not even ask. He would be what he had always been, the ultimate servant of the Republic. The inciting incident of his career's greatest disappointment was not a bang, but this quiet, suffocating realization in a room filled with the smell of evening shadows. Marshall straightened his tunic, the fabric crisp under his fingers. He looked directly at Roosevelt, his expression unreadable, a mask of perfect, terrifying discipline. He didn't let his voice waver. He didn't let the grief he felt for his lost opportunity show in his eyes. "The decision is yours, Mr. President," Marshall said, his voice level and firm, echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "My personal feelings do not enter into the matter." It was a statement of such profound abnegation that Roosevelt seemed taken aback for a second, his grip on the letter opener tightening. It was the purest expression of the soldier's creed Marshall had ever uttered. He was giving up the command that would have made him the American Wellington or Grant, handing it over to a subordinate because his commander-in-chief needed him as a stabilizer. The silence that followed was different now. The tension had broken, replaced by a somber, mutual understanding. Roosevelt nodded slowly, a look of immense relief, and perhaps a touch of guilt crossing his face. "Then it will be Eisenhower," the president whispered. "I suppose that is settled." Marshall felt the finality of it like a physical weight. The door to the battlefield had slammed shut, and he was left in the hallway of administration. He rose from his chair, the movement fluid and practiced. He had work to do. He had to prepare the orders for Eisenhower. He had to brief the staff. He had to continue the relentless, grinding task of winning a war from a desk. As he walked toward the door, he felt the ghost of the man he might have been, the conquering hero in the jeep, the liberator of Paris, walking beside him, then fading away. He stepped out of the Oval Office and into the corridor, where the bustle of the wartime White House resumed its frantic pace. The secretaries were typing, the aides were scurrying, and the hum of power was constant. Marshall walked through it all, a man who had just given away his heart's desire for the sake of a higher duty. In the months that followed, he watched from across the sea as the plans he had helped craft were executed. He saw Eisenhower's face on the covers of magazines. He read the reports from the beaches, the blood at Omaha, the chaos at Sainte-Mère-Église. He felt every casualty like a personal failure, yet he stayed at his post, the indispensable pillar of the American war effort. He never spoke of his disappointment. Not to Catherine, not to his staff, not even in the private pages of his diary. He buried it under the mountain of work that the end of the war required. The Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of a shattered world, the Nobel Peace Prize that would eventually come, not for his skill as a general, but for his vision as a statesman. Years later, when the war was a memory and the men who fought it were gray, Marshall would still be remembered as the man who didn't go to Normandy. But those who knew the truth, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and the few who saw behind the mask, knew that his greatest victory wasn't won on a beach in France, but in a quiet room in Washington, where a man chose to be a servant rather than a hero. The legacy of George C. Marshall was not written in the soil of Europe, but in the stability of the world he helped rebuild. A world made possible because one man had the strength to say that his feelings didn't matter. He walked into the cool evening air of Washington, the Washington Monument, a white needle against the darkening sky, and for the first time in years he felt a strange, quiet peace. He had done his duty. He had given everything, including his dreams, to the cause. And as the stars began to poke through the haze of the Capitol, George Marshall turned his collar up against the chill and walked toward the car that would take him back to the Pentagon, back to the maps, and back to the war he would win from the shadows.